The Last Light of the Sun is a 2004 novel written by Gavriel Kay, a Canadian author of a whole ton of books, who got started in his career editing the Silmarillion with Christopher Tolkien. And if you're wondering if any of the master's greatness rubbed off on Kay, rest assured that it did not. I'm not really overly concerned with genres and labels and such, but this is considered a fantasy novel. But it's a fantasy novel in sort of a similar way as the last book I spoke about on this channel, House of the Wolfings by William Morris. The Last Light of the Sun is more fantasy, I guess, because it ostensibly takes place in a secondary world, though, as we'll see, that isn't really true. The Last Light of the Sun takes place in what is, for the most part, a carbon copy of 9th century England and Wales, with an equivalent of Denmark called Vinmark. And that's the thing about the so-called secondary world. It's just medieval Europe with some of the letters switched around. This is basically the story of King Alfred the Great with serial numbers filed off. And that's fine, but it's so similar, there are so many real-world analogs, that it makes me wonder why he pretended that it's a secondary world at all. King Alfred is called King Aldred. The English are called the Anglican, which is the actual Old English word that King Alfred himself used to refer to the united Anglo-Saxon realms. It literally just means kin of the Angles. The Vikings are called Earlings. The Welsh are called Kingail. That's all well and good, but what is changed and what is not changed became a highly distracting part of the book for me. Like I said, Anglican is kept the same. The reference to the Fyrd, which is the sort of Anglo-Saxon militia, is kept the same. But other things are changed for inexplicable reasons. For instance, the real-world Jams Vikings are called Jorms Vikings, so an R is added to the word. The Norse festival / law court gathering, which is called the Thing in real life, Thing, is called the Thring in this book. So again, an R is added to the word, I suppose because Kay thought thing didn't sound cool enough. But then it makes me wonder why these references are here in the first place. Who are they for? Are they for people like me who recognize all the references? If so, as I said, the seemingly arbitrary nature of what is and isn't changed was extremely distracting, and most of it just felt like key jangling to me. This made it difficult for me to get into the narrative itself, and once I did get past all the key jangling, I found that there really wasn't anything deeper underneath to get to. One last example of this is that Kay has an equivalent to the gods Odin and Thor called Ingavin and Thunir. Thunir being one letter off from the actual Old Norse name Thunor. Except hilariously, Kay adds the double dot umlaut over the U in Thunir. I guess Kay thought Thunir would sound way more metal with the Spinal Tap umlaut over the U. But even stranger than this is that Kay has his characters wearing amulets of Ingavin's hammer, not Thunir's hammer. Despite being Odin in every other respect, he's the chief of the gods, he's one-eyed, he's the chooser of the slain. Ingavin, for some reason, in this book is the hammer wielder, which is obviously the most famous attribute of Thor in real-world Norse mythology. In fact, if people know anything at all about Norse mythology, it's that Thor has a hammer. But in this story, it's Odin with the hammer. No idea why this, of all things, was changed. Again, it's just extremely distracting to me and makes me wonder who the audience is. Might not be distracting for everyone, but to me, that was a head scratcher. Once you look beyond the key jangling and the references to every conceivable historical detail, there's even a reference to Ibn Fadlan, the Arabic traveler who wrote about meeting the Bruce Vikings. That is just taken and put straight at the very beginning of this book. Once you get past all of these things, there just really isn't anything there. There's no real overarching plot. The story lazily meanders around. It's unclear really where it's going until 3/4 of the way through. The characters are uncompelling and they're flattened by the writing style, and the narrative jumps between a huge amount of them, many of whom are random and unrelated to the main events of the story, such as the main events of the story even exist at all. Many times you'll enter the head of some random tertiary character who appears for only a few pages and then is never heard from again. Sometimes these characters die in the same scene that they're introduced in. Sometimes their entire life stories are told in 5 to 10 pages, which are essentially self-contained short stories, unrelated or at best like orthogonally related to the main story. And this happens over and over again. And I think rather than being merely a technical flaw, this reveals that the real weakness is actually Kay's outlook on history itself. Kay believes that history is just a series of random events without any meaning, into which random people can be swept up into happenings much larger than themselves. Although I don't want to overstate things here because there are no grand events in this book. Really, nothing happens whatsoever. There's a quote I want to read which demonstrates this. I don't really think this book has anything to say, but if it does say anything, it would be this. Quote, "It happens this way. Small things, accidents of timing and congruence. And then all that flows in our lives from such moments owes its unfolding course, for good or ill, to them. We walk or stumble along paths laid down by events of which we remain forever ignorant. The road someone else never took, or traveled too late or soon, means an encounter, a piece of information, a memorable night or death or life." So, beautifully written sentiment. Kay can write, that's not in doubt. And there is some truth to it, of course, except that this is supposed to be from the perspective of one of the Erling characters, who is a pagan. And if their religion is anything at all like real Norse paganism, they should have a much more fatalistic view. Norse myth had, after all, fate personified as the Norns, who are the women who weave the threads of fate. What Kay presents here is very much a modern view of the random meaninglessness of fate and history and time. Contrast this with House of the Wolfings, which presents foresight and fate as central elements of the plot. Morris presents a world where every action and event is wrought with meaning by forces beyond man's power and understanding, and it's every hero's lot in life to face it or fight it, to avoid it or embrace it. Or contrast that with a providential view of the world, like Tolkien's, where man's fate is not predetermined, but nor are events simply random. The hand of the divine is unseen but never absent, always guiding events to its own purposes in ways man can't comprehend. With these three views, we have the Christian, the pagan, and the secular views of history, fate, and time. Two of the three point to something higher. And I think this is the real problem, not just with Kay, but with all modern fantasy. All literature should point to something higher, but so much modern fantasy points either to nothing at all, like the last light of the sun, or it points down into the muck and the mud, and reading it is the equivalent of spiritually rolling around in the pigsty, eating the swine pods, coating yourself in filth because you're afraid of the sun. Again, in contrast to the House of the Wolfings and Morris, it might be the case that Guy Gavriel Kay knows more historical facts than does Morris. But for all his knowledge, he lacks understanding, and most of all, he lacks spirit. There is no spirit here. It is a thoroughly modern and materialistic fantasy novel, despite his efforts. Religion does play a big role in the story, but again, though Kay knows facts about Christianity and paganism, he doesn't understand either one. Now, if you'll indulge me, I want to talk about Julius Evola. Here's another quote from The Last Light of the Sun. "It is the humbling, daunting nature of this truth that can lead us to our gods, when pace and press subside. But it also needs to be remembered that sagas and idols are constructed, that someone has composed their elements, selected and balanced them, bringing what art and inclination they have as an offering. The tale of the Volgan's raid with a handful of men on a sanctuary of the sleepless ones in Ferrier will be very differently told by a cleric surviving the attack, chronicling the round of a dismal year, and an Erling Skald celebrating a triumph. Those inside a story do not usually think of themselves that way, though some may have an eye to fame and those who come after. Mostly, we are engaged in living." Again, a beautifully rendered passage, but I want to contrast this view with some of the things Evola writes about history, myth, and time in Revolt Against the Modern World. Firstly, one of the main ideas behind Evola's work is that heroic action is one of the ways in which traditional societies embodied or communed with the divine. He says, "In the traditional view of the world, every reality was a symbol and every action a ritual." And he says also, quote, "We find the idea that by means of a heroic death, the warrior shifted from the plane of the material earthly war to the plane of struggle of a transcendental and universal character." And this is said in reference to the Norse culture specifically, although the point of the work is to show the similarities between all traditional cultures. This is simply the pre-modern universal view. He says also, quote, "If traditionally empirical time was measured by a transcendental time that did not contain events but meanings, and if this essentially meta-historical time must be considered as the context in which myths, heroes, and traditional gods lived and acted, then it is possible that some historically real events or people may have repeated and dramatized a myth, incarnating metahistorical structures and symbols." And he says, quote, "This is the reason why some of the findings of modern scholars concerning the alleged historicity of events or characters of the traditional world, much of their obsession to separate what is historical from what is mythical or legendary, some of their doubts about the childish traditional chronology, and finally their belief in so-called euhemerism, can most decisively be said to lack solid foundations. In these cases, myth and anti-history represent the path leading to a deeper knowledge of what we regard as history." All this is to say that when we read stories of heroes, we should, in some sense at least, be reading about men who are aware that they are participating in one way or another in cosmic events. In fact, we should feel this about our own lives. One last quote from Hans Leisengang, which I found in a book on Christian Hermeticism. He says this, quote, "Every myth expresses, in a form narrated for a particular case, an eternal idea, which will be intuitively recognized by he who re-experiences the content of the myth." This mythical, rather than clinically historical and materialistic view of Guy Gavriel Kay is why authors like Tolkien and Morris achieve so much more. It's why their work is more powerful. It's why it will endure. It's why it is so rich and virile, while Kay and other modern authors' work is so sterile. It's because, at the end of the day, instead of facts, it embodies truth. Thank you for watching.